forward is to address the justice gap, I now invite Maaike, who will present on the OECD Council recommendation on access to justice and people-centered systems. Thank you very much, Maaike, for joining us.
Thank you so much, Zeynep, and thank you everyone for joining. Quite a good crowd online. I wish we could all meet in person, but happy to have you all here with us this afternoon or this morning. Thank you also to the Netherlands Ministry of Foreign Affairs and GIZ and possibly others who have taken really the lead in this Team Europe Democracy initiative to connect it to access to justice and people-centered justice and make rule of law one of the key themes and one of the working groups. I think that's really critical. And thank you, of course, to our good partners, HIL and World Justice Project, for giving OECD an opportunity to speak to our recommendation. If I can have the next slide, Zeynep, I will dive right in. So I won't go into this too deeply because it was already said also in the introductions, but where does people-centered justice come from? Just as a reminder, yes, those discussions that Sam referenced around justice as an enabler for social inclusion and economic growth in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals led to the adoption of SDG 16, which then sparked a lot of work around access to justice and focusing on the global justice gap. And out of those discussions and the work and the learning all together came what we now call people-centered justice as in a way an answer or the approach that is needed really if we want to provide equal access to justice for all. Still a very ambitious goal. But the recommendation, I think, captures the key steps or key components of working towards that goal. I also wanted to make two connections, I think, that are coming into sharper focus almost every day. Again, some of this was referenced in the introduction, but the idea of the rule of law as a critical concept, but not just or not certainly not as a set of rules or a set of institutions in the static sense, but really as a promise that is at the heart of what democracy is all about, that is at the heart of what social development is about, social inclusion, and the systems and structures that we need to deliver on that promise of the rule of law. Because the promise of the rule of law is really about how people should relate to each other, how they relate to their government authorities. But to deliver on that promise, we really need much more effective and better justice systems. And the last element is delivering a justice for all as a public service. So in a lot of the discussions we have with our OECD member countries, this notion that, yes, of course, there's a judiciary and that's a separate branch of power and the independence is important. But there's also a very, very important part of the justice sector, which is about delivering services to people, justice as a public service. And that part really needs to be much more responsive and inclusive and effective to resolve people's justice problems. So if I can go to the next slide. This, I think I will go very quickly because it was already said, yes, providing access to justice for all requires people-centered justice systems. It's data-driven and evidence-based, and it's really a roadmap or a program for the justice sector to address some of those key issues to make that transformation. If I can have the next slide, I just want to say two or a few things about the recommendation as such. It was adopted in July 2023, but it builds on a decade of work by the OECD, member and partner countries, and many other partners globally, closely connected to the process that Sam also described of the Task Force on Justice. Importantly, so now that it's an OECD recommendation, it means all OECD member countries adhere to it. The accession countries of the OECD, which is already a group of 8 countries and more in the pipeline. And just for context, this is not accession to the European Union, but accession to the OECD, which often goes hand in hand, but it's not the same process. But those accession countries will now be assessed against those key elements of the recommendation. And lastly, the point that the European Union has adhered to the recommendation. We're very happy with that, of course. It's the first OECD recommendation that the EU officially adheres to, so we're proud of that as well. And that makes it part of the acquis communautaire. So in your conversations with partners, I think that can also be an important component. So diving into the recommendation, then, if I can have the next slide, Zeynep. So the way it's structured is really, it tries to cover many different aspects of the justice sector, but in a logical, coherent fashion of different elements that can be addressed to move the justice sector toward a more people-centered justice system. And the green one at the bottom is actually where analytically the work starts, which is the foundation. And that is establishing a people-centered purpose and culture in the justice system. And I will go into detail for all of them, but just running through them quickly now. The first component then to really work on is designing and delivering people-centered legal and justice services. The second is really on establishing a governance infrastructure that enables people-centered justice. Empowering people to make people-centered transformation happen, and committing to participatory and evidence-based planning, monitoring, and evaluation. If I can have the next slide, I will go into each of these in a bit more detail. So establishing a people-centered purpose and culture in the justice system, as I said, that's really the foundation of the work. And this requires commitment at the highest level of government to people-centered justice, based on empirical data and evidence. And that's really a fundamental shift, that it's not just a normative ideal, but an empirical question: are we effectively providing justice for all? This requires whole of state and whole of society strategies. And one of the key instruments that we've seen to work on that, and to have the different actors of the justice sector work on that together, is defining shared goals for collaboration. So this requires collaboration between different actors, and so defining shared goals really transforms the conversation that these different actors have with each other. It makes a shift to empirical data and evidence, but it also emphasizes how different actors have different elements to contribute, and everyone has their own role and mandate. And whereas in the past, a lot of those discussions were focused on mandates and sort of institutional boundaries, if you set shared goals, you change the whole framework of the conversation. And then a good example of this is Canada, where this is actually not new. They did this about 10-15 years ago, but they developed a set of justice development goals, which are shared goals that all those actors who each have their role, each have their mandate, each have their independence, can work together to provide more value for society. If I can have the next slide. So the next part is on designing and delivering people-centered legal and justice services. And the key element here is to ensure that there's a continuum of legal and justice services. Again, this helps different entities work together, or it requires different entities to work together, so that people are not facing a plethora of actors and institutions and get sent from one to the other, but that their justice journey becomes a seamless journey, that there's a continuum of services that are matched to the problem they have, the severity of the problem they have, that those services are designed with people at the center based on evidence and taking into account, importantly, their needs, their preferences, and their capacities. So this really requires that the services that are provided are tailored to the people that you intend to reach. A good example for this, and of course there are, just to say that I mention one quick example for every slide because we only have so much time. There's of course many countries working in this area already, but Argentina developed a whole series, a whole network, I should say, of access to justice centers that really focused on delivering those services in a way that matched really people where they are and what they need. So going to the next slide, this is about the governance infrastructure that's really required to have these organizations work together. And this, again, matches the whole of state and whole of justice sector approach that was mentioned earlier. And it requires developing and implementing sound legal and policy frameworks to make those seamless justice pathways possible for people. It also requires meaningful engagement with different groups and strengthening coordination and cooperation mechanisms. And importantly, it really requires a different understanding of the role that the Ministry of Justice has about what its role is in the justice sector. And we've seen a number of countries address this by creating an access to justice secretariat. So countries as diverse as the US, on the one hand, the Department of Justice in the US, but also in Sierra Leone, have created a special part of the Ministry of Justice that takes access to justice as its key responsibility and then works on those coordination and cooperation mechanisms with the other entities to deliver justice for all. If I can have the next slide. This is about empowering people to make the people-centered justice transformation happen. And this is fostering legal empowerment and legal literacy. So this is really the participation side of things, making sure that stakeholders have equal and fair opportunities to be engaged in the design and delivery of justice services. And it's also about promoting competence, professionalism, and importantly, diversity in the justice sector workforce, so that when people look at the justice sector, they see a reflection of society, that the workforce is diverse, and people feel represented in the justice sector as such. Empowering and legal empowerment specifically has always been focused on a lot by civil society organizations. But the one example I wanted to mention, where it comes more from the government side, is in the Netherlands, where you have the legal services counter that provides free legal services and free advice to people. So then, committing to participatory and evidence-based practice. This is really about creating learning loops within and feedback loops within the justice sector. So Sam mentioned at the beginning how important it is to work on the basis of data and evidence, and these components mentioned here are really important to create the elements that are necessary for that. So it requires data availability, improving data quality, governance arrangement for justice data, and really those elements that are necessary to create that data-driven and evidence-based practice throughout the justice sector. And one example that was actually presented at our roundtable in Ottawa just 2 weeks ago is from the United Kingdom, where the court services really found a different way of analyzing data, identifying bottlenecks, and then using data to improve that. So then quickly to my last slide, I wanted to mention very briefly a few OECD tools that we have developed, and some of them are under development to work with countries who are serious about implementing the recommendation and making that transition to people-centered justice. So we are working, and this is forthcoming, as the slide also says, on an implementation toolkit for the recommendation, which will include self-assessment questions, priority actions, pitfalls to avoid, etc., etc. And that will, for each of these pillars, bring that information together in an accessible way. We have long worked on legal needs and justice, legal needs surveys and justice needs surveys, always also with our partners, HIL and World Justice Project. And OECD can also work with countries to develop such surveys. We have worked with many of our partner countries on a diagnosis of the justice sector, identifying priority opportunities for reform. We are working on developing a whole set of new methodologies for people-centered justice, including on the business case and measurement framework, in which context we will develop indicators together with our partners. A people-centered justice scan, as well as a country-specific implementation support. So this is many of our reports are online if you want more information, but we work with our OECD member and partner countries to support the implementation of the recommendation. And throughout, either in specific projects or throughout this country support, we work with digital and data as tools to support this transformation. There are There are two more slides in my presentation, but I have gone over my time a little bit, so I will leave it at that. But the presentation can, of course, be shared. And just to emphasize on a final note that we do indeed work in OECD member countries, but also accession countries and partner countries. And in all our work, we work with our many partners on these issues. So thank you very much. I will leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Maike, and thank you especially for adhering to the time. Um, Maike has now presented the global framework for the OECD recommendation. I will be looking at how this framework is being currently implemented at the country level. So as Maike and Sam both mentioned that the PCJ approach and the PCJ recommendation, even though the recommendation itself was introduced in 2023, are not new. There have been partners on the ground that have been testing it, working it, and implementing it through a whole of systems approach and identifying what is working, what's not working, and how to adapt it. So I will be going over the how this translates practically into actionable interventions. But before I can do that, it's important to take a step back and understand the state of the access to justice sector that most of us work in today. So, what we're seeing now is that there is a positive momentum amongst ministries of justice, innovators, private sector, judiciaries on developing solutions. We see that ministries of justice and judiciaries are often in the driving seat of innovations, and they're developing models that are effective, grounded in data and evidence. And this includes things like medical legal partnerships, scaling community justice models, setting up small claim courts. So we're seeing a lot of solutions that are coming in the access to justice space. However, the problem is that even though we've identified delivery models that are working and justice services that are effective, there is a challenge of scaling. And this was also mentioned by Sam. Why is it that most justice innovations fail to make it past 1 year, or even if they do, their impact stays localized and they cannot scale either nationally or regionally, depending on the context that we're working in. And based on our research and our experience, we've identified two reasons for why the access to justice sector is becoming a graveyard of pilots. Firstly, what we see is that there is a bad problem diagnosis. Now, what that means is that there is a problem with the starting point of all innovation in the justice sector, and this includes designing justice services. Often, what we see is that justice services are being designed based on what can only be described as urban myths. So, for example, one of the things that we see is that there is a belief that the reason why people cannot find solutions for their justice problems is that the law is too complicated. So the solution for that inevitably ends up being is that let's simplify the laws and then people will find it easier to resolve their problems. Another problem diagnosis that we often hear is that it is in fact the cost of lawyers that prevents people from accessing justice to courts. However, based on our research, we've seen that the avenues that people adopt to resolve their problems often tend to be in the informal sector, but a complicated spectrum of justice services, including friends and family. And often what we see is that cost is not a barrier to accessing justice. The second reason for failure of scaling is, in fact, that the second justice services make it past the 1 year mark or leave the vacuum of an innovation lab process or a design thinking methodology, is that they encounter a hostile enabling environment for scaling. And this means that there are legal, financial, and regulatory barriers that prevent justice services from integrating into the main justice chain. An example of this is that most regulatory frameworks in a lot of countries bar justice service providers other than lawyers from providing access to legal services. Another barrier is that financial systems of ministries of justice are often geared towards maintenance, but not towards supporting innovation or scaling of justice services. So, how do we get across? How does the OECD framework and a whole of system approach address these two main challenges that the access to justice sector is facing today? So we've kind of developed a clear, practical, and actionable strategies that we characterize within three main steps. So the first one is diagnosis to address the challenge of bad diagnosis. And this inevitably starts with the Justice Needs and Satisfaction Survey. So a Justice Needs and Satisfaction Survey is a quantitative research method which we use to quantify people's needs, but we also use it to map people's journeys. Where are they going to resolve their problems? Which justice providers are they approaching? What are the outcomes that they're seeking from the justice process, and what is effective and what is not worked? This is supplemented by qualitative research so that we can understand the lived experiences of those that face justice problems. At the same time, and this speaks to the emphasis of the OECD recommendation on developing a culture of PCJ, this is supplemented by a vision workshop where we convene the high level justice leadership along with other key justice stakeholders such as academics, policymakers, and then they look at the data and the research and they use that to formulate ambitious outcomes based goals. And at the same time, to make sure that the goals do not remain just goals, they also come up with indicators in the form of outcome monitoring formats. And this provides a comprehensive approach to diagnosing the justice problems at the country level. Then, using the outcomes based goals, we move on to the design. And this is the part that has the most traction across most justice systems that we see. So, using the outcomes based goals based in data, we facilitate the development of evidence based guidelines for justice providers to make sure that the services that they are, in fact, providing people facing justice problems are grounded in best practice and evidence. At the same time, we also facilitate through our justice innovation labs the development of justice services or delivery models that provide access to justice and address key justice problems based on data. And the Justice Innovation Labs don't just come up with solutions, but in fact, they also work on developing sustainable financial models to support scaling, but also a governance model that allows the solution to be integrated into the formal justice system. And as we spoke about earlier, the enabling environment is a key step in the design process. If there is not an enabling environment, your solution will inevitably end up facing a roadblock in the form of legal barriers or financial barriers, or inevitably it will end up in the graveyard of pilots. So from design, we move on to delivery because design at the end of the day can just end up being a piece of paper. So, how do we take our well designed service to delivery and actually implementing it and scaling it and integrating it into the formal justice sector? So, here we come to the implementation of pilots to test whether or not the assumptions that we made based on our data are actually true in a real life setting. But also, how do we develop the capacity of ministries of justice and judiciaries to scale these justice services? And most importantly, how do we develop feedback loops based that will allow us to monitor the implementation of services to ensure that they continue delivering outcomes for the justice users? And an illustration of where we've implemented this approach, I would like you to take you on this journey that the Ministry of Justice in Ethiopia is adopting to move towards a people-centered justice system. So the PCJ journey, as I can call it in Ethiopia, started in 2020 with the first JNS survey. So the Justice Needs and Satisfaction Survey in Ethiopia found that Ethiopians face 7.4 million legal problems annually. And out of these problems, 5.2 million remain unresolved or are perceived by those facing them as being unresolved unfairly. Now, what we also found from the data was that 80% of the population take some form of action to resolve their problems. So we know that people are interested in seeking some kind of resolution for the problem they're seeking. But what we also found out was that 43% of the people are not going to the courts, but to the village elders. And this is the most popular form of dispute resolution in Ethiopia. And only 18% were in fact visiting the courts. And in only 1% of the cases, and this is also mostly in urban areas, were Ethiopians engaging lawyers to resolve their disputes. Now, these insights allowed us to organize several vision workshops with the ministries of justice and key justice stakeholders. And then as an outcome of these workshops, the stakeholders decided to focus on the resolution of land and family problems, which were the most common and impactful problems that people were facing based on the data. But also, the outcome that they wanted to work on directly was to scale the community justice models across the country to meet the demand for justice services. And this was enshrined in a 3-year justice sector transformation plan that the government is currently working on rolling out. So this is an example of how to create a good diagnosis, but also supplemented with creating a broader vision on people-centered justice. Now, at the same time, regional authorities in Ethiopia and the Oromia region revived customary courts. And the model was so successful at the regional level that it resolved an average of 367,000 cases in a small period of 2 years. So this really became the basis for convening the Justice Innovation Lab by the ministry and local experts. So the Justice Innovation Lab was convened basically to consider how they could take the successful model of community justice in the Oromia region in the form of customary courts and scale it nationally. So based on the design human-centered methodology that they adopted in the Justice Innovation Lab, the participants came up with a delivery model called Community Justice Center. And the Community Justice Center model essentially provides a first stop to people facing justice problems of land and family at the community level. It provides people with access to information, advice, referral, and mediation services. And at the same time, it engaged community justice representatives that took the services all the way down to the Kabyle level, which is the smallest administrative level in Ethiopia. And to address the problem of scaling, the Community Justice Center model was also integrated with the formal justice sector in its design. Now, because the lab participants included a broad section of stakeholders, which included also the formal justice stakeholders with the community stakeholders, but also the users of justice, the model enjoyed widespread acceptance, and there was a commitment on the behalf of the government to scale it. So now we move from diagnosis to design, and now we're in the delivery phase, where a legal impact assessment is currently being conducted and on its way to being finalized to provide the government with a roadmap on how they can scale this model across the country. So what is the way forward that we've learned from adopting this approach across different countries? Well, the first thing is, as Mike also emphasized, we need a whole of system approach. People-centered justice cannot occur in a piecemeal fashion or through individual interventions. It has to be adopted across the justice system and across diagnosis, design, and delivery of justice services. What we've also learned and what we experience is that there is a great demand for people-centered justice, and the demand can only be met in order to respond to political opportunities if funding is available in a rapid and flexible manner. Now, as Hill, we have received requests from many different countries, but we are unable to provide our technical support because we do not have access to rapid and flexible financing. And at the same time, there is increased support needed to take well-designed services from design to scaling, and this can only come if we rethink the way we currently fund justice services. And as was emphasized by many of the other speakers, we need to invest in an enabling environment for people-centered justice services. And at its core, we need to support the shift of institutions to support a diagnosis based on the needs and experiences of people. Thank you very much, and I'll stop there and give the floor to our next speaker from World Justice Project, and that is Mr. Alejandro Pons. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Sania. I'm going to share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for joining today. So today I'm going to follow up on just what Mike and Sania and Sam had mentioned, and try to go a little bit deeper on what it really means to look at data and evidence. We usually hear that a lot, but it's difficult to think about what are really just the data sources available for justice practitioners and what are the benefits that each data source has. And importantly, just understanding just the strengths and weaknesses of the different data sources, how can we use them, and eventually, how can we strengthen the justice data ecosystem, produce better data, and use the data that we currently have better just to support justice action. So just as to begin, I think that it's quite important. I mean, there are a lot of different data sources available in justice. And part of the challenge that we have is that often these data sources are not people-centered. So it's very important that when we think about data, we start with individual. So we start with the needs of the people. And that's the starting point. So when we think about the legal need and then just when someone faces a problem and has a need, that has to be the starting point for the data that we collect. Usually when an individual has a legal problem or a legal need eventually, just there are two routes, just very simply, just they can either take action or do nothing. Uh, and whenever they took action, just they can just go to a variety of services. They can look for information, they can look for assistance, they can look for representation, they can go to a formal or informal justice institution to try to adjudicate the problem. So they try to do something to solve the problem. And eventually, just depending on what they do, they're going to get an outcome, and eventually that outcome is going to have an impact in their lives, right? So just whether they are able to solve their problem with the neighbor or the divorce or child alimony, that's going to have an impact on their lives just and their well-being. So then when thinking about data, it's quite important that we start with individual and we think about the different data sources that can inform us about that justice journey that the individual is going to take. And unfortunately, we have different data sources that can help us and that can inform that journey. So thinking about first, how can we know when an individual takes no action, when an individual just this doesn't really get into the system? What's the type of information that we can gather so that we can just inform the actions? So the first piece of information just that we have is the legal needs surveys. And the legal needs surveys are a tool for whenever an individual has a legal need, just regardless of whether they go to the system or they do nothing, this piece of information can tell us a lot about what the people are doing. And the reason is because they ask people about their problems and then what they do whenever they have a problem. And then we follow up with what they do whenever they decide to take action. So it's a unique tool for looking at the demand side of things. I mean, seeing just how people see issues, how people experience themes, and importantly, when they do nothing, I mean, that information doesn't get into the system, provide us information why they don't do nothing, or when they simply look for information but actually do not follow from there, or they don't look for information and then suddenly the problem is not resolved. That's very difficult to capture through other types of data collection exercises. So legal needs surveys are quite helpful for gathering this information. And as we have heard, that is indeed quite important because that can inform justice policies that are most cost efficient and probably more effective than simply trying to look for policies that advance policies in the formal justice system. So that's a strength. Obviously, a weakness is that it's limited what we can learn just whenever they enter into the system, simply because of the nature of legal needs surveys. And there are a lot of different exercises that have been done around the world to try to inform this. Just as Sani mentioned, I mean, HIL has done this over several years in several countries. The OECD a few years ago produced a model because legal needs surveys can be quite extensive and quite expensive. a model just on a reduced set of questions that could be included in other data collection exercises that can capture some of the key elements of legal needs of people. And at the World Justice Project, we included that model as part of the exercise of the Rule of Law Index of the General Population Poll, which is a survey that we conduct in more than 100 countries to indeed produce information about the legal needs of people in a large number of countries. So these exercises have been conducted in several parts. And just if we think about what's the information that we can get the type of problems that people experience, what they do when they have a problem. So this diagram, for example, shows just at a global level, just what people do. So just whether people know just the type of problem that they may have, whether they look for some help, whether they just try to solve it, they take some action, go to some institution, to which institution they may go, formal, informal, what the outcome is there, whether they're able to resolve the problem, a little bit about the process, whether they consider it fair, how long it takes, whether they have financial difficulties, and importantly, just what's the outcome just in the end, how does it impact their lives. So it's a lot of information, and importantly, just the information that we cannot capture through other sources. So it's quite valuable when thinking about justice interventions to gather this type of information. Something that can give us, for example, is if we think about what are the main determinants of people solving their problems. I mean, where should we invest? I mean, if we think about a policy intervention, should it be in information? Should it be representation? Should we encourage people to access formal or informal institutions? Do informal institutions can provide good outcomes? So that's information that a legal needs surveys can provide and can help us answer. So that's an important piece of data just that we can collect. And obviously, just these are usually just high-level surveys. The challenge is that sometimes just they are not that specific for certain types of problems or certain types of populations, but they can be customized to address those limitations. And if you want information about the different legal needs surveys that have been conducted all around the world, so just we collect that information just in the Atlas of Legal Needs. Just you can just look at information in the different countries, and you can see just the legal needs surveys that have been conducted in that country, and in the data is available, just links to the data. So then, now, another piece of information that a lot of countries collect, and that is actually quite important as well, is data when people enter into the system, right? The system can be either when they ask for legal help, or whenever they try to get just a resolution through a formal institution. So then they enter into a system, and then there is information there about the flow of just how those cases and how people are moving through the system, right? And that information is quite helpful, just in many cases, if we think about how to make things more efficient, what's the time that actually takes in resolving cases in certain institutions, how the inputs, how the resources have been used, I mean, just the productivity of people. I mean, that's quite important, I mean, for improving processes. And there's just good data sets, I mean, as well available, depending obviously just on the situation of different countries, but it's quite important that information to help indeed just make more efficient and more people-centered processes as well. The limitation, obviously, this is a supply side. I mean, it's almost, I mean, just the analogy of the health system. I mean, this is people who enter in many cases into the hospitals, right? I mean, we cannot think about public health only by looking at data at the hospitals, but it's quite important if we want to indeed improve just how hospitals deliver health. Just so then that's the type of information that we will need. And it's important when thinking more broadly about justice policy. And there are some examples. For example, the EU collects a lot of information about different processes. I mean, just summarizing the justice scorecard, just that information, for example, about estimated time to resolve a case, just in a lot of different countries over the years. So that can help indeed trace this. This information, if well collected, just can even be used not only at an aggregate level, but at a disaggregated level as well, just at the level of a court or at the level of a state. So it's important indeed just to guide and to monitor progress and how things are doing. Court fees, for example, it's another case of information that can be collected through this. And indeed, many countries, I mean, beyond the EU, are trying to improve these efforts. Just there are obviously there's variation on the type of data, and importantly, the type of indicators that they produce with the data, how much disaggregated the data is. But there are some cases, for example, Dominican Republic just has an observatory, I mean, that produces information about cases just by location and so on, and is used to track some performance. So something that supplement as well, I mean, thinking just about information when we get into the system is information surveys to judges, prosecutors, clerks, lawyers. I mean, that can help us better understand processes, incentives, barriers within the system, so that it's equally important to really make the system better. And finally, just also thinking about outcomes, but the limitation, for example, of legal needs, as I mentioned, is that it has limited exposure or measure just when people get into the system. But there are some other tools that can still give us this people-centered perspective, this outcome perspective, for example, looking at users of a particular service. And that really takes a look at the experiences of people when navigating the system. At a more granular level. And there are examples, for example, just the court surveys, inmate surveys, and so on. There are some countries that have conducted court user satisfaction surveys. This is one in Tanzania, or countries that have conducted inmate surveys just to understand just due process and really just how inmates navigate the criminal justice system, for example, in Mexico, in the poll by INEGI. So we can get information about satisfaction, about barriers, perception of fairness, due process, time, attitudes towards certain actors. So that's valuable information that we can gather. So in summary, just data provides valuable information on people's legal needs, how authority responds to these needs, and how just we can contribute to the development of policy. However, I mean, we know that many countries still face technical, political, financial barriers to the production and use of data. Some way forward. So collect the right information, just produce the appropriate indicators. Something that we see is sometimes just information is collected, but not the right indicators are produced. Micah mentioned just a project that we have ongoing with the OECD and HEAL, just to develop frameworks of indicators on what we should be measuring, or at least provide a guide. Considering context is important when thinking about just innovations. If we want to collect data on something more specific, where some of the issues are prevalent, I mean, to collect the right information, not necessarily invest in collecting information about courts when only a few percentage of people go to courts. Be smart using existing data collection mechanisms. In some countries, it's very expensive to conduct a new survey, but there may be some mechanisms conducted by statistical agencies, surveys that could be used to include some questions and start gathering information about legal needs and the experience of people. Leverage technology. Just today, there are a lot of different ways of collecting information, cell phones and so on. I mean, we could use that, just other types of data, AI and so on, and encourage a culture of open data, just of really just developing an ecosystem in which a lot of actors can use the data. This is not only about just state actors, but really just generating data that researchers, universities, civil society can use to inform public policy. Encourage collaborations. Just we know that just everybody knows something about these processes, and collaborations can be quite helpful to improve data collection exercises, the use of data, and so on. And finally, promote the use of data and evidence. I mean, it's not only about producing data, it's about using data as well, using it to inform policies. I mean, if there is no demand for data, just it's unlikely that data are going to be produced. So we need to encourage and promote the use of data for programs and policies. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alejandro, for a useful overview of the various data tools that are at our disposal for implementing comprehensive PCJ programming. So now we're going to take some time to hear from all of you. Please raise your hand if you have any questions for any of our speakers, or if you would just like to say something. You can also use our chat if you'd rather prefer to type in your questions. Just a housekeeping rule that we have around 20 minutes for discussion and questions, and then we'll break out into two groups. One focusing on data-driven and evidence-based approach to problem identification and looking at the case study of Kenya. And the second one looking at leveraging data and evidence to design PCJ services. And in this one, we'll be looking at a case study for Nigeria. So this is just to motivate you to stay on with us. Great. So the floor is all yours. Yes, I see that Simona has raised her hand.
I'll leave the floor to Lina first from Kenya.
Yes, please, Lina, go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much for very interesting presentations. I am managing a large access to I'll just turn my phone, sorry for a second. A large justice reform program in Kenya, which is actually the biggest investment from the EU in justice reforms in Africa, south of Sahara. And we have really struggled quite a bit. I can share in the session, as you also mentioned, a little bit on how we're trying to get around increasing the access to justice and people-centered elements of justice. But one of the issues that you also touched upon is the culture in the justice sector. And I just wanted to share with you all that we had what we call a results-oriented monitoring of this large project quite early on after implementation for just 1.5 years. That just was concluded a few weeks ago. And one of the findings of the consultants that were more illustrative than data-driven was that he turned up in one county where he was, the justice actors, the judges, the prosecutors, and just one second. Sorry, I have some little people making some noise in the background. Where they were all on time, they were speaking very dedicated, they were really kind of like giving him a lot of access, information, they followed up with emails and phone calls with additional information. And then, he spoke to civil society that was very committed and did a lot of work, and that was very positive in that county about their engagement in the court user committees, the work with the authorities, and he went to another county in a similar region. And then, later he went to the other part of Kenya, and Kenya has 47 counties or regions. So, it's a big country. And he visited 2 counties where in one of the counties, the judge turned up 1.5 hours late, wanted to question him a lot about why he was there and why he was meeting with him. And, he had already been briefed by his colleagues in Nairobi. Didn't really give him any substantial feedback, had tons of calls when they were meeting. The prosecutor didn't turn up, and people from the police were like almost avoiding to meet him, but was then finally pinned down in a meeting and was sharing, kind of like very basic information, but not something that was informative. So I also just wanted with this to illustrate that even within one country, we can have super committed actors at national level, and in one part of the country, or you have individuals within the institution that are super committed in some parts of the country, and in other parts of the countries, you have some individuals that, because they act as they do, the justice delivery is not at all people-centered. It's very inefficient. It is very old-fashioned, and it's very institutional and very difficult to see progress on cases properly. So what do you then do when you have countries where there's so much difference and where you have extremely dedicated officers and you have officers that are really lagging behind in their commitment to delivering justice to the people? I think this is quite common in many other countries, but I just wanted to hear whether you have some experiences with dealing with such situations. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for your question. And you're right. I mean, there's always a mix of actors that we must contend with. But I can see that Sam has written in the chat and he's also raised his hand. Sam, would you like to respond?
No, just to say, Lina, it's good that you raise it. I mean, the key thing, as far as I can see, and that's why Kenya is already different than other places with the court user committees and stuff like that. You will never eradicate, people who work less hard or who are less good at what they do. The thing is that if you monitor performance based on outcome and you have good data, you can know that it's happening and then you can act. And if you have this culture that the OECD recommendation speaks about, that you need to deliver on these things, that it will harm your career, for example, to behave like that it's not invisible. And I think the big problem is that in most justice systems where there is no data, this behavior is invisible. So you're very much dependent on whether people are good. But if you have systems in place that measure performance, that make, for example, the court user committees, I understand, are part of your performance appraisal as a senior judge, then you're starting to change things. But it's a tough one. Yeah.
Thank you. So next in line, I have Simona and then Maike.
Yes, thank you. I have a question regarding the systems in place to measure, progress on access to justice from a people-centered perspective. So Alejandro mentioned the 3 different types of analysis that can be done, whether focused on legal need or service provision or perception of services provided. But obviously, they all require investment on this. The examples that you gave for the legal need analysis shows that they were all done by, either HIL or the OECD. Well, the OECD one was more of a overall assessment on how to do this kind of surveys. But so I was wondering if you have country examples that where these analyses have been done by the authorities, and they have been done maybe on a regular basis, either jointly or at different times, but the different types of analysis is being done. Because obviously, I think all of them have merit and all of them require regular updates, not just a one-off exercise. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to direct this question to Alejandro, and I see that Martin is also here, so feel free to pick it up as well. Go ahead.
Yeah, I can answer something and then just probably Martin can complement. Thank you, Simona. Yeah, this is a good question. I think it's a mix, I will say. I think there are some countries in which the information, as you mentioned, has been collected, for example, by HIL or World Justice Project. In many cases, in collaboration with the government, and I think just Martin can speak about that. It's not simply just that they're collecting information. It's just it's demand driven in many cases. In some of the cases, the government is already collecting the information. There have been some efforts, not many, just of countries of trying to either develop legal needs surveys. Some countries, as part of UNDP, has pushed in this effort of generating information about indicator 16.3.3, which is based on legal needs surveys. And there are some cases of countries that have indeed just started some pilots, but there are very few. There are some other countries that have done exercises. I mean, it has varied on who has driven that. In some cases, it's the Ministry of Justice who have conducted the exercise. In some other cases, in collaboration with the statistical agency, just have been able to include some questions in larger surveys. So, for example, Colombia has been including just legal needs, just models, just as part of the data collection efforts. Argentina conducted a legal needs survey just with the support UNDP. So it varies. I think probably a challenge is that just because they are not institutional, and I think that's a problem of sustainability, just the projects or the surveys in many cases are conducted on an ad hoc basis. So one, it's useful just for planning the next strategy and so on, but then there is a new government and sometimes just that is lost and that information is not collected again. So ideally, the scenario that we would like is that this is conducted in general as part of the data collection exercises of countries, and that's probably an effort that we as a community should push, that it is part of the poverty surveys, the social surveys, so just some elements so that it can be conducted on a more regular basis and tracked over time. Martin.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Completely agree. And there are some other examples of countries which gather such data. But my dream, and I think this is also the vision of the OECD recommendations, is that such sort of data gathering is part of the national justice measurement systems, just as they are now gathering a lot of data about cases, disposition of cases, backlog, etc., etc. At some point that we start seeing the demand and the supply, the outcomes that justice is delivering for users. So just like Alex said, data can be coming from different sources. And at the moment, what we see in almost probably every justice system in the world is that the huge focus is on cases. Like you can have an awful experience, awful example of justice or perfect one, but then the system just have to as one single case, which took like 7 months, or you're part of this or that group. So I think we are going to into this direction.
Hello.
Zainab, over to you.
Thank you very much, Martin. And I'm going to give the floor to Micah because I know you have to leave as well. Go ahead.
Thanks, Zainab. Well, I'm happy to stick around if there are any more questions until we go to the next part of the program. But I think on this importance of data, that is obviously core. I do recognize the points you raised, Simona. Like, what's the frequency? What's the investment? How do you get it organized? What's the national ownership? So it's not an easy topic because the investments are significant, and there's quite a bit of translation needed from the legal needs survey to policy implementation. I do think it's a critical step, especially a broad legal needs survey, because it helps to really change that understanding. Many lawyers working in the justice sector, lawyers and judges, have the impression that the system is working relatively okay. There may be some delays, there may be some backlog, the work may be too, work pressures may be too high. But that is because they only look at the part that they see, which is the cases that come before them. And the real purpose of the legal needs survey is to open that perspective and see, well, but the cases that actually reach the formal justice sector are only a small part, and the percentages vary from country to country, but it's hardly ever more than 10% and often lower than that of the problems that people face that actually make it to the formal legal system. So that's why that, at least as a baseline survey, I think a legal needs survey is a critical instrument, because it broadens that discussion, and it also shows the more formal justice actors that there are a range of needs that are not being met. It also demonstrates that there's a lot of actors who actually provide justice that are not the courts and the lawyers, and that brings us to those questions of collaboration. We are looking, though, in the context of some of our OECD projects, particularly the one with both the Netherlands and Ireland, at how can you complement those larger scale population surveys, the legal needs surveys, with either more frequent types of data gathering that's still people-centered justice, that still goes to the people to find out what the issues are, or with more qualitative, tailored surveys and analysis. And how can you also strengthen the analysis that you do by combining the data? This is also what Alex was saying, the legal needs survey with the administrative data and perhaps even demographic data that you may have about the people that have justice problems. So that combined analysis, I think, can really help improve practice. If the system is focused on those data, willing to work with them and taking that as a basis, which for me is really at the core of what people-centered justice is all about. And that also connects to the question from Line in Kenya. And I think Kenya in that respect is no different than any country in the world, in the sense that there's always differences between courts, between lawyers, between different areas, between different people. So the people-centered, the justice workforce, as we sometimes call it, is also made up of people, and people are different. But that is why this people-centered justice purpose and culture is so important, that you require that the leadership in the justice sector, and that's not one person, but the different leaders in the justice sector really commit to this idea. Well, it's not just about the formal side, the institutions, the mandate, the laws. It's really about how do we as a justice sector provide value to our society? How do we resolve those problems? How do we provide access to people and deliver services to people? And that shift, I think, is necessary from the top, and then data driven, and if that data is public, then you get the type of incentives that Sam was also referring to, where people have to change their behavior and have those kinds of conversation with each other. And that, I think, is when you're getting towards that transformation that we talk about in the recommendation.
Thank you very much, Micah. I received a warning message from Frederica that we have to get moving. So this is a great discussion, and we should pick it up in our breakout moment to sort of hand over to Mr. Jonathan van Meerbeek, who is the head of sector of democratic governance at DG INTPA. Can you please close off the clinic with your remarks? And thank you very much to everyone who stayed till the very end. We're very grateful to have the opportunity to have this dialogue. Thank you, and over to you.
Many thanks, Sainamak. I hope you can hear me fine. I must say it has been 2 hours, but and extremely dense. But I must say it's very difficult for me to stay awake and for webinars more than 60 minutes. This time around, I've been taking notes for the whole time. I find it quite passionate, I must say. We learned quite a lot on the importance of data, of course, the importance of evidence. And I was there in 2019 at the Hill Innovative Forum, where we, of course, discussed all these issues of people-centered justice. I'm very pleased to see everything that has been achieved in the meanwhile. I'm very pleased to see that now we have a framework, thanks to the OECD recommendation, access to justice. I think this is very interesting that we have now this to guide us our work, and we are very much impatient and looking forward to the toolkits that the OECD colleagues are working on. On our side, as was mentioned by Sam and the colleagues, the EU has aligned and endorsed the recommendations. That means, as Sam was saying, that now it is part of the acquis, and that's something we can very much push on our partners. So that is great news. On our side in DG INTPA, we've had quite some experience around this, and we had a very interesting evaluation. Maybe we can put it in the chat. Like 2 years ago in 2022, on our support to rule of law, and quite a lot of what I heard today really echoes our findings from that evaluation. I must say also that's something we'll encourage also my colleagues from our member states on the need really to have a thorough assessment. We have been asking all our delegations, colleagues in this call from our delegations know that we systematically ask them every year to look at the World Justice Project. Here I do a little bit of publicity for the colleagues from the World Justice Project, the Rule of Law Index that was released yesterday. We ask our colleagues every year to look at that Rule of Law Index, and that informs our internal assessment. We have this so-called risk management framework, which is an internal assessment that we do of the situation in a given country, and we look very much at the situation of rule of law in a given country, and the index from that perspective is something that we systematically ask our colleagues to use. Just for you to know that's something that we always try and systematically consider in all our actions, and that informs the whole of our cooperation in a given country. So we learned that we have quite excellent partners and methodologies, and that we're exposed to gather data, to implement the solutions. I take with me very much the importance of those legal needs surveys that were presented by Alejandro and Zainab to show to the formal justice actors the needs that are not met through formal justice, and we know that there are many, of course. I remember from Zainab really this methodology of going from diagnostic to design to delivery, from pilots to scaling, from our discussion on the case study of Nigeria, the difficulty sometimes to attract donors into something that can be quite of an iterative process. So important to get donors to chip in early, to get governments on board from the outset as well. That's also something that I take from our discussion on Nigeria. So quite a number of tools and approaches that will chart a roadmap really to address these issues of people-centered justice. And for my colleagues, really, the operational colleagues here in countries, my pledge really is to bring back to your country and to your particular domestic context what we learned today, which is, first of all, we have now a framework, the OECD framework. We'll still have that toolkit, hopefully. They need to invest into the production and data and availability of data, and that's something that also our partners in countries lack very much. So important to show to them the importance of those data to inform our programs, which should be innovative and evidence-based for better delivery of justice. Looking ahead, we have 2 minutes left now. I've been asked to give a few to tell you a bit about next steps. There will be another clinic on the 26th of November, focusing on customary, informal, and community justice. You'll be receiving the communication in the coming days, and I see that colleagues are also sharing in the chat. There is a survey in the chat as well that we very much want you to complete. It's extremely useful for us to tailor the clinic, as Valentine was saying. It's super useful. You can reach out to the TED Secretariat if you have any additional thoughts and ideas. So if you want to follow up on the discussion today, you may want to share some material, information, you can channel that through the Secretariat. And finally, last but not least, yet another big thanks to all the colleagues who have been in this call today, all the network partners for your contributions. Very much to our speakers from HAIL, World Justice Project, and OECD for this extremely enriching discussion. And of course, to all the participants for your very active participation. I wish you a very nice evening or an afternoon, depending on where you are. Goodbye and see you in November. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Lena. You're on holiday.
Thank you, everyone. I'll leave now. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.